So our reading comes from Micah, the 6th chapter. Hear what the Lord says. Rise, plead your case before the mountains, and let the hills hear your voice. Hear, you mountains, the controversy of the Lord, and you enduring foundations of the earth. For the Lord has a controversy with the people, and God will contend with Israel. O my people, what have I done to you? In what have I wearied you? Answer me. For I brought you up from the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery. And I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. O my people, remember now what King Balak of Moab devised, what Balaam, son of Beor, answered him, and what happened before Shittim and Gilgal, that you may know the saving acts of the Lord. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before God with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams and with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? God has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Let us pray. And I ask that you not only pray with me, I ask that you pray for me. O most gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of each and every heart and mind here gathered be pleasing to you, because it is you who are our rock and our salvation. Amen. Sometimes it's a good idea to look up a definition, even of a word that seems basic to one's vocabulary. So, I looked up basic. Basic means fundamental, essential, or elementary, such as in It's Elementary, my dear Watson. Recently, my husband John and I attended a high school basketball game between two rival high schools here in the Eastern Panhandle. We both loved the game. I grew up in a state, Kentucky, where basketball is, well, almost a religion. And John played ball at a small Presbyterian college in North Carolina. But as we watched the game that night, one thing became very clear. Neither team had a good grip on how to play the game. Our friend who was with us, who himself had played ball for one of the teams when he was in high school, told us that their current coach doesn't believe in practicing the fundamentals of the game. All I can say is someone needs to be doing just that. The players couldn't shoot, especially from the free throw line. They couldn't pass, and they were called several times for walking, which means they couldn't even dribble. They needed desperately to get back to the basics of the game. We might do well to remind ourselves that we are in the season after the Epiphany, a season meant to clarify both the identity of Jesus and those who respond to his call. In many ways, this season within the life of the church, this season after Epiphany, is all about the basics. Epiphany begins with the story of the wise men's visit to the Holy Family, found in Matthew. Matthew often quotes the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, what we usually call the Old Testament, to show that Jesus is a fulfillment of God's promise of a Messiah. Thus, when the wise men asked where they might find the child that has been born King of the Jews, Herod summons the chief priests and scribes and inquires of them where this Messiah is to be born. In reply, the scribes and chief priests quote the prophet Micah. So it's only fitting that we look to that same prophet during this season. The prophet's words shine light on what it is that God requires of those who seek a relationship with the divine. What are the basics, the essentials, for those who would follow the ways of God? During the time of Micah, the people were not following the ways of God. God wanted to know why the people had grown tired of doing the will of the very one who had delivered them from slavery out of Egypt and had given them the promised land. They in turn asked, how can they restore relationship with God? They suggest several possibilities, each more severe in its demands than the previous. The speaker even suggests that God might require the sacrifice of one's firstborn. Then the prophet Micah interrupts and provides the answer. God has already told you what is good and what is required of you: to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with God. We might say that these are the basics for those seeking a relationship with God. These are fundamental to our call to walk as disciples of Jesus Christ. The demand for justice runs throughout the scriptures, both in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. Justice is at the very heart of God. It is essential to the nature of God and is a fundamental activity of God. Theologians speak of three types of justice. The first, communicative justice, focuses on relationships among members of the community. One community member is not to treat another in an unjust way. People are to live free from oppression and abuse. The second, distributive justice, ensures the equitable distribution of goods benefits, and burdens within the community. All are to have enough of the world's goods. 1 John 3:17 asks, how does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses to help? If I have more than enough, and I do, and others don't, what does God's justice require of me? The third type of justice is social justice, which affects the social order necessary for distributive justice. Policies and practices need to be in place to ensure that all God's children, all of humankind, are cared for. No one will go hungry. No one will go homeless. No one will go without health care. No one will be jobless or lack for an education. The poor will receive good news. Micah was concerned with all three types of justice. This very text emerges from God's disappointment because the people have violated God's justice. Those in power have used their offices for gain at the expense of the common people. Lands and houses were expropriated. Material goods and benefits are not justly distributed within the community. A few have most of the wealth, while common people bear most of the burden of labor. Micah says that the powerful tear the skins of God's people and send violence upon the poor. In a culture fascinated with material wealth, religious leaders had commercialized their ministries. A common feature of the times was the unrestrained self-interest of those in power. Although they still engaged in pious talk, these officials had found another authority other than God to rule their actions. Last week, I helped a good friend as she finished transitioning from active ministry to retirement. We packed up the last of her belongings from a rented condo in Rehoboth Beach and moved them to her new home in Frederick. On the outside of many of the boxes we packed, I wrote, "Fragile, handle with care." It's a way of letting those who unpack know that the valued contents inside are breakable or easily damaged. Micah says that God's second basic requirement is to love kindness, or as several translations of the Bible read, to love tenderly. I think we would do well if we could imagine that written on the forehead of each person we encounter are the words, "Fragile, handle with care." Those words would remind us to be tender in the treatment of all those whom we meet through the course of each day. The world is a harsh place. A day doesn't go by that we don't hear of someone having inflicted some callous or cruel act upon others. The most vulnerable in society endure torture, abuse, taunting, bullying, insults, and other forms of violence, both verbal and physical, because others with more power avail themselves of the opportunity to crush the spirit or the body or both of another. When we love tenderly, we stand up for those who are not being treated kindly. In his letter to the church at Corinth, the Apostle Paul tells us that love is kind. Indeed, the Hebrew word for kindness used in Micah, hesed, is often translated as loving kindness. Like justice, loving kindness is a basic characteristic of God and essential for those who follow God's ways. Most of us have favorite musicians and favorite songs. I came of age during what is known as the British invasion. Now, anyone who was or is a Beatles fan has a favorite among the Fabulous Four. Mine happens to be George Harrison. And my favorite song of his is My Sweet Lord. While those who analyze such things don't agree on what Harrison intended the song to mean, I know what it means to me. For decades, its words have served as one of my basic prayers. My Lord, I really want to see you, really want to be with you, really want to know you, really want to go with you, my Lord, my sweet Lord. We have hymns that reflect the same longing. We would see Jesus, or I want Jesus to walk with me. It's a basic prayer for those who seek a closer relationship with God through Jesus Christ. The phrase to walk with God seems rather archaic or poetic in its way of saying that God expects us to have faith. And we may assume that faith equates with belief. But faith is something quite different. Faith is lived activity of knowing, trusting, and doing God's will. This notion of faith is what Micah had in mind when he reminded us to walk humbly with God. The people during Micah's time struggled to know and remain faithful to God. As long as they remembered and were committed to God's covenant with them, that God was their God and they were God's people, they did walk humbly with God. But when they forgot this and put their trust elsewhere, in themselves, in power, or wealth or nationhood. They became lost. Once we recognize that God and nothing else is God of our lives, we yearn to know what God expects of us. And that leads us to Jesus Christ and the words at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, known as the Beatitudes, a title derived from the Latin word beatrice, meaning blessed. They recall the words of Psalm 1:1. Blessed are those who do not walk in the counsel of the wicked. Here the word blessed means literally to find the right road. These 9 Beatitudes are, like the words of Micah, about the character of God and what is essential in our relationship with God. Like the basics in Micah, they direct us to the right road. Thus, Jesus calls blessed those who act in accordance with the ways of God. While each beatitude begins in the present tense, each ends in the future tense. They tell us that righteousness and peace will finally prevail, and that God's future will be a time of justice and love and mercy, not viciousness and violence. Blessed are those who live this life now, even when such a life seems foolish or futile. For what does God require of each of us but to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with our God?